Hello everyone, it's time for another review of one of DC Comics' New 52 books. For those of you who are new, DC Comics did a line-wide reboot of their comic book universe at the end of 2011. I have been reading the first volume of various series from this new universe called the New 52 and declaring if the series gets a pass or a fail from me. And now I am going to talk about All-Star Western, written by Justin Gray and Jimmy Palmiotti, with art by Moratat. I should start by saying that I am not a huge fan of westerns in general. I am not exactly sure what it is about stories set in the Old West that sets me off. Maybe it's similar to my disliking of zombie stories. In addition to not being much of a fan of stories set in the Old West, I know next to nothing about Jonah Hex. I know that he briefly had adventures set in the far future in the 1980s, and I know very basic things about his personality, like that he is gruff and grumpy but still has a heart of gold. Fortunately, I don't think you really need to know anything about Jonah Hex in order to read this. It is definitely more new reader friendly than books I've read like Justice League Dark, Legion of Superheroes, and Legion Lost. And that's astoundingly important when a company is doing a reboot. Trying to keep everyone, even lifelong fans, confused about what exactly is going on, shockingly isn't a good move when writing comics sells almost exclusively to those fans that you are trying to alienate. But like I said, All-Star Western doesn't do that. It helps you along when you need help and lets you just enjoy the ride without trying to confuse you. Hardcore fans of Jonah Hex might not like the idea of Hex going to Gotham City to have a few adventures. While I don't read Jonah Hex, I know that Gotham is not his stomping grounds. But while it might not have gone over well with lifelong readers of Hex, it did succeed in bringing this Batman fan into the book. This book was not actually on my list of titles from the New 52 to check out, but I saw it at the comic book shop, I wasn't buying very much else, and I was curious to see how Gotham was handled in a different time period. So I got it as an impulse purchase, and I am definitely glad I did. This book is different from most other things that I review. For the purposes of this point, there are two kinds of characters, static characters and dynamic characters. Most of the time in things I review, the characters are meant to be dynamic in that they start out being in one place and then the events of the story transform the way they act and just who they are in general so that they are in a different place by the end of the story. Static characters are called such because they don't change. They remain the same. And usually I am not much of a fan of static characters, as I feel like the whole point of a story is seeing the character go through the changes as he or she interacts with the story. And this story features static characters. Hex doesn't seem to be changed in any way by the end of the story. At the beginning, he hates his partner and the city, and at the end, he still does. Amadeus Arkham starts out being a meek man of science, and at the end, he's a meek man of science. I'm not entirely discounting static characters. When you are dealing with a character who doesn't go through changes, it makes it easier for the audience if they are not keeping up with the series. For example, since I don't read the ongoing adventures of Jonah Hex, I didn't have to worry about knowing where Hex was in his ongoing personal journey, since Hex doesn't have personal journeys. So it wouldn't matter if this was the first Hex story I read or the last. But with no character arcs, it's hard for me to judge this book on how good it is. After all, just because I enjoyed something doesn't indicate the quality of it. One thing I did find a little odd about this book was the things it chose to pay homage to in Batman's backstory. Throughout the entire book, Jonah Hex is working with psychiatrist Amadeus Arkham, who you can probably guess is the guy who will eventually turn his mansion into Arkham Asylum. Amadeus Arkham's first appearance in an actual comic book story was in Grant Morrison's Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on a Serious Earth. This book revealed that Arkham went crazy in the 1920s when a former patient of his killed Arkham's family. For those of you who have read this All-Star Western book, you might realize that that poses a bit of a problem. This book is set sometime vaguely in the 1880s. We're never told how old Arkham is in this book, but he's not married and he is a doctor, which seems to imply to me that he has gone to school to become a doctor, unless that wasn't something people did in the Old West. Anyway, it seems to me Arkham can be no younger than 30 as of this book. That would mean that if Grant Morrison's Arkham Asylum story is still part of the DC universe, then that would put Arkham at being in his 70s when his family was murdered. This is also made murkier by the fact that Dave McKean's artwork has always been difficult for me to decipher, so it's not easy to tell exactly how old Arkham was supposed to be in Morrison's story, but I'm pretty sure it's safe to say that he wasn't in his 70s. This is why I feel like this book could have been set at a different time period. Maybe say that this is closer to the turn of the century, and have Hex be an older, even more gruff bounty hunter with bad manners, and have Arkham be a young, just out of medical school doctor who is investigating the mind as a sort of hobby of his. Since Jonah Hex has his origins tied to the Civil War, you couldn't just make him be set in a different time period without alienating fans of the character. But I see no reason why they couldn't have just had this story be set later in Jonah's life. Maybe they felt it wouldn't matter if they played around with when Arkham was alive, but for someone like me, it just bothers me, even though I know it shouldn't. And if you're a huge fan of Jonah Hex, I'm not suggesting that the ongoing adventures of Hex should have featured him as an old man. I'm just saying that one story arc could have been set much later in Hex's life, and then the next arc could have been set in the 1880s. With this book being called All-Star Western, it could have been feasible, as Hex doesn't even have to be the main focus of every arc. If one story is set in Hex's old age, the next arc could be about El Diablo, and then the next arc could be set when Hex was a young man. But alas, that isn't what Gray and Palmiotti wanted to do. And you might say, this is a reboot. They aren't beholden to stick with any of the stories that came out before the reboot. And you'd be right, they actually aren't beholden to do that. Except that they do that. Alan Wayne, Bruce Wayne's ancestor, makes a cameo in this book, and he first showed up in the Gates of Gotham miniseries, which came out before this reboot. And at one point, the Crime Bible was mentioned, and that is also something from before the reboot. Putting Arkham in the 1880s doesn't really bother me as much as I am letting on, but I do find it strange that Gray and Palmiotti went out of their way to reference things from before the relaunch, and then went out of their way to mess with the chronology of Arkham's life. Moving on, let me talk a little bit about the team-up between Arkham and Hex. This is your typical buddy cop type of drama, where neither of the partners like each other, but they are forced to work together for reasons X, Y, and Z. It feels a little bit forced at times, like how if Jonah Hex is loud and rambunctious, then of course Arkham is quiet and very mannerly. They are basically the odd couple of crime fighting in the Old West. And even though setting this book in Gotham for the first arc is what made me buy the book, by the end of the book I am glad to see that Hex is leaving Gotham and won't be coming back for a very long time. I am not saying that a Hex book set permanently in Gotham could not work, but when you hear Hex complain relentlessly about how much he hates this city, you kinda want to see him just go ahead and leave so that he's got one less thing to bicker about. And maybe he bickers all the time, I don't know. If so, perhaps it's a good thing I don't read his stories. I do love seeing the various quiet references to the Batman lore that new readers and old readers will recognize, but I think this is a gimmick that could only work for so long, and eventually you want to see your protagonist move on. And I think Gray and Palmiotti caught on to that and did just that. In the end, this book is a strange one. I think it is more solid than at least 3 of the other books I've read from DC's New 52, but I'm not sure if it's enough to keep me wanting to come back for Volume 2. This has less to do with the quality of the book, and more to do with me just not being much of a fan of westerns. I do think that if anyone is curious what books from the New 52 they should try, All-Star Western is definitely the one, if you could only pick one. And while I say I might not get Volume 2, you never know. I didn't originally plan to get Volume 1, and I did, so there is hope after all.